Evil people exist all over our world, and some unfortunately still walk among us. Today's list is full of some of the worst people still living and breathing on this planet, and it most definitely is not for the faint of heart. Buckle up, Top 10 fam, because we've got more serial killers, both identified and unidentified, to talk about today as we dive into part 2 of the top 10 alive evil people you should fear. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have Rose West. Rose West is an English serial killer who committed her crimes alongside her husband. He definitely also would make a spot on this list, but he decided to take his own life in 1995 after being arrested while awaiting trial. The terrible pair were investigated and subsequently arrested for taking 9 lives together, with Rose receiving an additional charge for another 10th life. During the court proceedings, against the advice of her counsel, Rose decided that she would testify herself, and what a trip that was. During her testimony, she sometimes was very tearful and dramatic, but of course an act like that can be hard to keep up, so other times she was cracking jokes and laughing. Imagine doing your tight 5 while you're on trial for the worst of the worst crimes. Luckily, it seems as though the jury hated that as much as I do, because they came back with a unanimous verdict of guilty on all 10 crimes. Get this though, in prison, Rose West met Myra Hindley, which if you don't know who that is, she committed a bunch of very similar crimes with her husband as well, and the two became besties and even had an affair, but throughout this whole thing Rose is still trying to say that she was totally innocent and that Fred was completely responsible for all of the crimes. So wild. In our number 9 spot today we have Dennis BTK Raider. The BTK killer, whose real name is Dennis Raider, was one of the worst serial killers from 1974 to 1991. He left taunting letters for police and newspapers where he described his crimes, but thankfully this annoyingly large and misplaced ego is what led to his demise. After a 10-year hiatus from his disgusting crimes, he couldn't keep his mouth shut, so he began communicating with the media again in 2004. This communication, combined with his lack of knowledge on how technology works, led to his arrest in 2005. During his trial, he didn't apologize for his crimes, but he did describe them in full detail, which is horrifying and extremely eerie. I could not even imagine having to be there during that. After his trial, he ended up being sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years. When Raider was first arrested, when the police were taking him to the station, an officer asked him, "Mr. Raider, do you know why you're going downtown?" To which he replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." In our number 8 spot today we have Randy Kraft. Also known as the Scorecard Killer, Randy is a monster who took the lives of at least 16 young men between 1972 and 1983. The Scorecard nickname comes from how, after his arrest, police found a coded list that contained cryptic references to his crimes and the victims. On May 14, 1983, 2 California Highway Patrol officers observed a car driving erratically and suspected that the driver may be impaired, so they pulled it over. Once the car pulled over, Randy Kraft got out and identified himself and subsequently failed all field sobriety tests. At this same time, the other officer went over to the passenger side where he sadly found Randy's final victim, 25-year-old Marine Terry Lee Gambrell. The next 2 days of investigation revealed the horrors of what Kraft had done, and on May 16, 1983, he was formally charged with the one crime, but many more charges came in the next months. His trial first began on September 26, 1988, and on August 11, 1989, the jury rendered a verdict of death and the sentence was upheld. As of this year, he still remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to deny any responsibility for the crimes. Like they didn't find one of his victims in the passenger seat of his car. I think the gimmick might be up, Randy. In our number 7 spot today we have the Sleepy Hollow Killer. Starting in 1997, there were a series of killings in an area of South Africa that are all believed to be linked to one unidentified suspect who is being called the Sleepy Hollow Killer. During this time, it was believed that 13 crimes could be attributed to this person, and despite investigations, whoever the perpetrator was, authorities were unable to identify them. There was a small hiatus from the crimes, which is sometimes referred to as a cooling off period, but in 2007 they unfortunately began again. While the more recent crimes varied slightly from the originals, authorities believe it is the same person, active yet again. There has only been one public suspect in this case, police, but unfortunately it is no longer believed that he had anything to do with these crimes and that the one he committed was entirely separate. It really is horrifying to think of people who do things like this being able to get away with it for a number of years, so let's just hope that they are caught very soon. The good news is that a special task team has been formed in order to really look into these crimes and explore and examine all of the circumstances, modus operandi, and all of the material evidence. In our number 6 spot today we have Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. This is a double whammy because unfortunately both of these people are still alive, but the good news is that at least one of them, Paul, is still in jail. This horrible pair are often referred to as the Ken and Barbie killers, and while Paul started off living a life of crime, he quickly brought Karla into it as well after their meeting. That is not to say she is not just as guilty as him, however, because they are both fully responsible for their own actions. While Paul was arrested for a multitude of crimes, the pair were arrested and convicted of taking the lives of 3 separate people, one of them being Karla's sister. See what I meant about them both being responsible for their own actions? The investigation into the crimes proved to be quite difficult, with authorities having plenty of hoops to jump through, and this is why a plea deal was created for Karla. She had 1 week to accept or decline the deal, which would give her a sentence of 12 years for her full cooperation. She accepted. Both were convicted in 2005, and Paul was up to apply for parole in 2018, and in October of that year he was denied parole. His next parole hearing was recently on June 22nd of this year, and it only took an hour of deliberation to decide to turn down that application as well. I think 30 seconds probably would have been enough to decide, but I'm just glad the outcome was the same. Karla, on the other hand, served her 12-year sentence and then was released, like years ago. She moved away from Canada and headed to Costa Rica for a while with her new husband and children, if you can believe that. But unfortunately she has since moved back. In our number 5 spot today we have Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is an American serial killer who was convicted for taking the lives of 10 people, including his paternal grandparents, as well as his own mother. Wikipedia told me that he is noted for his height, as he is 6 foot 9 inches, and for his intelligence, as he apparently has an IQ of 145, but I personally think that he is most notable for being an absolute monster. His first crime took place when he was just 15 years old, and that was when he took the lives of his grandparents. After this crime he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent time in a hospital before it was determined he was rehabilitated and he was released at the age of 21. After his release, he unfortunately went on a spree where he would target young females who were hitchhiking. After his final crimes he ended up confessing and turning himself in, which is something we really don't see all of the time. When asked in an interview why he confessed, he said, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time." 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined and observed him and found him to be legally sane, and thus he was able to stand trial. On November 8, 1973, the jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. He has been eligible for parole since 1979 and has been denied every single time he applied, one time saying, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me." I can't fault them for that. He is eligible to apply for parole again next in 2024. In our number 4 spot today we have the Long Island serial killer. Also known as the Craigslist Ripper, the LISK is an unidentified suspect who is believed to have taken the lives of somewhere between 10 to 16 people over the last 20 years. The victims so far that are known have been sex workers who use Craigslist to advertise their work. After the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, police were searching an area along the Ocean Parkway, and that is when they began to discover the remains of the victims. The first 4 were found in December of 2010, with another 6 being found in March and April of 2011. As of December 2015, the FBI is now officially involved in the investigation. There has been a suspect in the case, but any formal charges have not been laid in terms of these crimes. The most recent evidence in regards to these cases was a belt found at the scene of the crime, which may potentially belong to the killer. At the same time, it was announced that new scientific evidence was being used in the investigation, but these announcements came just last year, so we have yet to receive any further updates. Hopefully the case is solved quickly so that the families of the victims can receive justice and this terrible person is off the streets for good. In our number 3 spot today we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more killings came to light. Unfortunately, in 2010, the Crown stayed the rest of the charges, but I suppose at least he was convicted of the 6 he was initially charged with. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Apparently, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. Which is super ironic, considering you're confessing your crimes to an undercover officer. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at that time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so here's hoping that that never ever happens. In our number 2 spot today we have Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin is a serial killer who was convicted for 3 separate crimes, but it is believed his crimes may actually be up in the range of 40 to 50. Before being convicted of these crimes, Peter also served another 10-year prison sentence for other crimes committed, and he was released from prison for those crimes in 2004. 3 years later, however, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years for taking the life of Angelica Kluke in 2006. After this, remains of 2 more people who went missing in 1991 were found in his former home, and he was also tried for these crimes, which ended up solidifying his sentence to a whole life order, which means he will never be up for parole. There are some who believe Tobin is responsible for more unsolved crimes, and he has been labeled a psychopath by a senior psychologist. Apparently, while in prison, he has boasted about taking the lives of 48 people, despite the fact that he's only officially been linked to 3. Hopefully, if this is true, the connections are discovered soon so that the families and loved ones of those victims can receive the justice that they deserve. In our number 1 spot today we have Gary Ridgway. This horrible human being is also sometimes known as the Green River Killer, and his crimes took place somewhere between 1982 to potentially as recent as 2001. He was convicted for 49 crimes, but confessed to an unbelievable 71, which makes him the 2nd most prolific serial killer in the United States in terms of confirmed killings. Most of his victims were either sex workers or women in other vulnerable circumstances, and through DNA profiling evidence in 2001, authorities were able to connect him to 4 of his crimes. From there, they made a deal with him where they would spare him the death sentence in exchange for the disclosure of the location of all of the missing women. Gary took the deal and was spared a death sentence, and instead was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not only did he say that he chose the type of victims he did because they were easy to pick up and that he hated most of them, but he also called his crimes his career. So, he sucks. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Sorry it was a bit of a dark one, but I appreciate you sticking it out with me. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski. Don't do any of the things that were on this list today, and I'll see you next time. Bye!